panel here that we're going this appears more formal than it is going to be. What I hope we can do is have a much more kind of casual conversation. The second is really sort of teeing up the second panel, which is looking forward at how we can kind of improve, really taking on Cindy's challenge, the Associate Deputy Minister's challenge, and thinking through, how do we inject ideas into the global partnership as threats change, as technology changes, and so forth. So this panel, as I say, is really a scene-setting exercise, and it's less academic, not just because Trevor Smith said we have to dumb it down, but also because I really want to have a much more kind of casual conversation, because we have a truly remarkable group of folks, even Trevor, here on this.
See what I have to put up with.
It's going to get worse. So here's the order of battle. I'm going to introduce our three panelists here and tell you a little bit about their backgrounds. And then we're just going to have kind of a casual conversation. And I really encourage all of you, particularly the students in the room, who we didn't hear from, you missed an opportunity to speak to the Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, which is shameful. You should all be getting in her face every time you have the opportunity. She's an incredible person. So take advantage of the opportunity, I hope, to ask questions or make comments as well. We'd love to hear from you. So this panel, as I say, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of a scene-setting exercise. So we talk about the history of the global partnership, some of the successes of the global partnership, some of the failures of the global partnership, some of the challenges that we have seen over the course of the multiple decades that the program has been operating here. To do that, as I say, we've got three remarkable individuals. Sabine Nölke is retired from global affairs. It's hard to believe that this young woman is retired already. She served as the Director General of the Non-Proliferation Bureau at Global Affairs Canada and had a remarkable career at GAC. She served in the High Commission in London. She was the permanent representative at the OPCW in The Hague. She was Canada's ambassador to the Netherlands. She served in Ghana. She served in Ireland, along with multiple other positions at the Foreign Ministry. So this is a unique opportunity because having someone who served inside, who has now stepped outside, she can now speak freely in ways that the two individuals on either side of Sabine are somewhat restrained, although these two characters will no doubt speak quite openly. I'm going to then turn to Trevor Smith. Trevor and I have worked together, which is why I can insult him. I don't know if I can't insult him, why I do insult him, yeah. He's a senior program manager at Global Affairs Canada and has been around. He was standing in a field when these programs got started, and they just built the building around him, and so they decided to give him a job. He's a Soviet specialist, and so has a remarkably kind of nuanced view of these programs. Because he's done this for so long, he's much older than I am. He is, he can speak with such depth. He's a particular expert in biological and chemical weapons, although has done nuclear work in his career as well, and as I say, knows these programs at such a granular level. Kathleen Lowe, who gets the credit for traveling the furthest from Washington, is with the U.S. Department of State. Kathleen, a remarkable individual in her own right, is the U.S. coordinator for the Global Partnership. And it's a unique position in that you look and have this sort of bird's eye view across not just U.S. government programming, which is extensive, by the way, but also does a lot of work, of course, coordinating with, as Cindy mentioned, the 30 partners across the Global Partnership. So again, another really unique resource. So if I may start with you, we're counting on you to shake things up a little bit. You had, because you had such a remarkable career, both operating these programs, overseeing these programs, but also then in the field, for instance, at the OPCW, but also in Ghana and elsewhere where you would have witnessed firsthand the kind of practical application of these programs. I wonder if you just sort of a little bit set the scene for us, Sabine, and talk about reflect for us a little bit on kind of the early origins of the program and what you saw, especially in the early days, as some of the big kind of successes, and then we'll get to some of the challenges that you observed.
Okay. How do I turn this thing on? Is it already on?
It's on.
It's up there.
Yeah, I think you're good.
So I'm a dinosaur.
Apparently I am too.
Okay, good. I think that's better. Can people hear me? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks for the introduction, Brian. And yes, it's really liberating to be retired. I can now say what I really think, and that's amazing. But there's also a bit of a problem with it. And before I start saying anything, I want to issue that disclaimer. I was the DG of Canada's WMD threat reduction program from 2011 to 2015, and then I was in The Hague from 2015 to 2019. So time has passed since then. And I know I've been invited here because of my experiences and, my, I suppose, expertise, but I'm also keenly aware that that is getting a little bit outdated. And I don't want to be that person who pretends I still know everything that's going on, because I just don't. So I'm counting on Trevor to correct me if I say anything that is no longer accurate or that has moved on. And in fact, I invite him to do that because I don't want to give any false impressions, pretending that I still know stuff that I don't. So with that said, when I came to the Global Partnership Program in 2011, first of all, background, I'm an international lawyer. So this was my first policy and programming position in the department. I've always been in the legal bureau before that, looking at the disarmament world and terrorist threats, etc., from the legal side. When I came there, it was 2011, it was under the Harper government. And what that meant was budget cuts. And we had the initial creation of the Global Partnership was a 10-year time frame, from 2002 to 2012. So in 2012, we were looking at having to renew the funding envelope. This was the same year that the Harper government introduced the Deficit Reduction Action Plan, also known as the DRAP by Canadian public servants. We turned it into a verb, you have been dragged. So this wasn't a good time. And the big challenge, I think, of the day was to convince our political masters that there is utility in prevention. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental problems that the Global Partnership has, is when we're talking about threat reduction. Is there a threat if nothing happens? Was it worth spending $25 billion, looking at the figure that the GP has spent by now, when there hasn't been a nuclear security incident? How do you prove that prevention was successful? And that is, I think, an enormous challenge that the Global Partnership has, politically speaking, but also with regard to the public. JoQ public only sees problem when they can watch them on TV or read about them in the newspapers or on the internet. They don't see problems that haven't happened because you've managed to not have them happen. So that's a big challenge. Now, as Cindy said, we did get renewed for 5 years. I steered through a memo to Cabinet arguing for the renewal. And it was touch and go at the time, because we had a foreign minister at the time, John Baird, who really wanted to be the minister that handed back the most money from his department back to the Central Treasury at the end of his tenure, or at the end of each fiscal year. That was what he wanted to do. And he was quite clear about that. And, more power to him. But if I want $100 million a year for my programming, that's a really awkward spot for me to be in. So that was tough. We got renewed, and in part, timing is everything in the public service. And the Global Partnership Program is not, immune from that. The 2012, so you have the drop on one hand, but on the other hand, you have the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit happening. And Prime Minister Harper wanted, he was going to Seoul for the NSS summit in 2012, and he wanted to have it announceable. So, my political push was, here's your big announceable, is the renewal of the program and any projects that we might want to be able to do with the money that you're going to give us. So that worked. So we got renewed, we got a haircut. I think we went from $100 million to 76.4. 73.5, I thought it was, whatever. So we lost about 25% of our funding, but we got 3/4 of it back. We were renewed on a permanent basis in 2018, which is great. But you know what? My experience from 2012 tells me that if there's a change in government, we cannot take that permanency for granted. So that will be an ongoing challenge, and it's a political challenge. Our politicians think in 4-year chunks. They don't think in the long term. They want to, prove results that will get them re-elected 4 years hence. So any long-term project isn't that attractive, and spending money isn't attractive either. So I think that's an ongoing challenge. Another challenge that we had, Cindy said it was a G7-led global partnership. Well, when I started, it was the G8-led global partnership, because Russia was still in the group. 2014 comes around, Russia starts its first invasion of Ukraine over Crimea, and they got kicked out of the G8. They got kicked out of the global partnership. We were supposed to have global partnership meetings in Moscow, marching orders, you don't go, nobody goes to Moscow. So the geometry changed completely in the space of a year. But not only that, but also the GP initially was created essentially to deal with WMD threats emanating from the dismantlement of the former Soviet Union, which means all the money went to Russia. Wrap your mind around that for a moment. In 2014, the Russians have become the international pariahs that they have subsequently proven themselves to be even better. No money for Russia. So here goes all our programming. What do we do now? So the global partnership under my tenure shifted to become truly global. Before, the sense of global was partners from around the globe, all focused on Russia. Now it's partners from around the globe, focusing on threats around the globe. So that was a substantive shift. But so our programming changed dramatically. We went into, as Cindy said, Southeast Asia. Central Asia was already part of the former Soviet threat, so we were already in Central Asia at the time. But Africa, particularly on the bio side. So a complete shift, requiring new expertise. Who knows anything about biolabs in Africa? Well, Trevor and his colleagues built that expertise up from the ground. So that was very interesting. But now we go from there to the successes. Having to change the program, and a lot of that change actually started with this 2012 memo to cabinet that I mentioned. Of course, I can't go into great details because these things are classified, but we had to convince our political masters that going global was the way to go. We had to adjust the threats that we were responding to, from dismantling Russian nuclear submarines to whatever else we needed to look at. We had been spending several $100 million, I think $250 million in Russia destroying their chemical weapons stockpiles. So the wisdom of the day was chemical weapons are done, we don't need to deal with those anymore. Luckily, I had this thought that threats change, so let's write into this memo a blank check and any other threats that might arise, which was essentially this loophole through which we could fit, guess what, chemical weapons back in 2015 when the Syrians started throwing them around. So that allowed us to do that. And so the success then of the global partnership, and now I'm coming to the success, and I'm sorry for talking so long, but there was quite a bit of stuff happening, was that when threats actually did arise, and were actually visible, we were there really quickly. We still had to deal with the minister who didn't want to spend any money or sign up on projects for which we already had the money, didn't want to spend it, but we got him to do that anyway. So we ended up being able to spend, I think initially about $15 million on Syrian chemical weapons destruction, all the declared stockpiles, because they kept stuff that they didn't tell anybody about, and they still have it. But all the declared things we managed to destroy. We put $6 million into Libya when they found chemical weapons stockpiles from Gaddafi in the desert, where about 20 kilometers from where ISIS had its headquarters. So that was a concern. And we also then subsequently were able to fund the OPCW's work on inspections and investigations for the OPCW. But the really good thing about that is that when you have the money to bring to the table, you can shape the policy that follows. And it's the hand-in-hand process of talking the talk, but then also being able to walk the walk. So when Canada speaks at the OPCW, and this is where I now come in 2015, I'm moving from my desk in Ottawa to my office in The Hague. When I spoke at the OPCW, I spoke with $75 million behind me that I could apply to some of the issues, provided Cindy would agree. Actually, my successor was Heidi Hulan at the time. That we could apply to actually implementing the things that we said needed to be implemented. So we funded the investigations in Syria, which then also allowed us to play a leading role, and I really do mean a leading role. We throw that word around in international affairs. Canada plays a leading role, but in this particular case it was actually true. In creating the investigative mechanism for Syria, the IIM, we worked on creating the IIM in New York. Sorry, that was the investigation into crimes in Syria, but also the process that investigated and attributed chemical weapons use in Syria, and that was a first. And the interesting thing there, of course, was that in New York, the Russians have a veto. At the OPCW in The Hague, they don't. It is not a consensus-based organization. So when you carry out your diplomacy and your advocacy efforts in The Hague on chemical weapons issues, you can actually achieve results, even if the Russians don't like it. It makes for a really interesting dynamic. Let me tell you the stories I've got, how the Russians carry out diplomacy when they actually have to do it, as opposed to when they can just say "niet." It's a fascinating process. And the program, the GP, allowed me to do that. All I would have to do is phone Ottawa and saying, this is what we want to do. Do we have some money that we can do that with? And the answer would be, okay. And it gets done. And Andrew, I see Andrew smiling over there. He was at the receiving end of some of those messages. So that's the really great thing. And this is something that we don't get to do very often, unfortunately, in Canadian diplomacy anymore. Because it's all about budget cuts, and it's all about, justifying what you do. On the WMD threat reduction side, we can do this. We are a player. And it is, it is extremely effective. It is useful. It is rewarding. It is important, and it has outcomes. Even though now we're circling back to the beginning, how do you prove prevention? I think we can do it. I mean, we have quite a few success stories. I think we need more success. And this is something, Natalie knows this. I was trying to get my team to collect success stories so that we could, publicize them. Disruption of radiological source trafficking. Those things you walk through at airports, Do you always wonder why does everybody get herded through these doors? Well, those are the detectors that make sure that you don't walk through there with a radiological source in your luggage. And we installed those in Ukraine, and yes, we caught people trying to, we've done a lot of these things that the public unfortunately doesn't know about, and that is, I think, the biggest outcome that I would say out of the WMD threat reduction program is actual tangible prevention work, difficult to prove, but it's out there, and the hand-in-hand march of funding with diplomacy where it really, really matters and really makes a difference. I'll shut up now.
Thank you so much for that. Kathleen, you want to jump in quickly?
Now I'm struggling. Is this?
Yep.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I certainly don't want to steal your thunder or talk at over your time or anything, but I would, if it's okay, like to just talk a little bit more about a challenge that I've seen, if that's okay, and the practicality of it. And Trevor and I have talked a lot about this as well. And of course, with Sabine, Trevor, if there's anything I'm saying that you would like to correct, please do feel free for me as well. But one of the challenges too is I think we see a lot of global partnership members assuming that they need these big dollar budgets to make change. And one of the messages that we try to really, really drive home is that real capacity building and change definitely, as we know, $25 billion, it definitely can be acquired with a big budget, but it can be acquired with a small budget, or it can be acquired with in-kind contributions, or regional influence, or subject matter expertise. And I don't, we've talked a lot about it. I'm not certain what the solution is, but I definitely think that since we have such a big body of global partnership members, I think that's one of the things that right now we really need to focus on is countries that don't just have a big budget, but those countries that don't have any budget at all, but still want to be part of that threat reduction community, need to know that what they're doing actually is contributing. And then you talked about publicizing those things. I think we also need to make sure that global partnership members know that when they are doing in-kind contributions, regional exercises, trainings, whatever that they're doing, it's not coming along with the big budget, that they can take credit, not a great way to say it, but take credit for that great work. So I'll be quiet with that, but I appreciate your comments and letting me chime on top of
Sabine,
that.
do you want to just jump in really quickly?
Yeah, I do, because I just checked my notes. I wasn't reading my messages, I was checking my notes there in there. A couple of things I forgot to mention. The first one was I think the rise in biosecurity programming. That was the result of the shift away from the former Soviet Union, because they wouldn't let us into their biolabs in the Aral Sea, of course. So we couldn't do very much about that. And as Cindy, I think, alluded in her opening remarks, the work that Trevor and his team did, particularly in West Africa, it really came to the fore during the Ebola crisis. I don't know if you guys were born when that happened. You probably were. Because it allowed us, we had built the expertise. There's no difference between diseases and pathogens that are naturally occurring and those that are placed into the wild by terrorists. It's the same pathogen. So the response mechanisms that we helped create and underwrite, including with the WHO, really came in handy during the Ebola crisis and really handy during the COVID crisis. So these kinds of structures, when security has many dimensions, it isn't just evildoers, but climate change is a security threat, and there's nobody deliberately behind it. So that, I think, was a huge impact of the Global Partnership Program, building that response expertise. The other thing that I kind of alluded to in the partnership between programming and policy, one of the things that the Global Partnership was able to do, and this gets into inside baseball a little bit, within Global Affairs Canada, was to back up needs that weren't appropriately funded by our center. So for example, our non-proliferation policy folks don't have a travel budget. I mean, they do, but it's like, doesn't allow you to go to where you needed to be. Well, there were times when the Global Partnership could step in. If you could make the link to security threat reduction and non-proliferation is always there, we were able to fund that. We were able to fund people within global affairs to go on temporary duty assignments through the Global Partnership. This isn't exactly what it was intended to do, but if you could fit it within the policy envelope, it enabled us to do things that the short-sightedness of our political masters when it comes to funding the Department of Foreign Affairs, or as it now is, Global Affairs Canada, it made up for that. And this is me speaking freely. I mean, the funding of my department is absolutely ridiculous, and you've heard it from me. But we were able to catch some of that, and that I think is also a very valuable, if unseen, contribution.
Thanks, Sabine. I want to come back to you at some point and press you a little bit on some of the political challenges you observe, because you can speak a little bit more freely. But I was interested in the point that you made in terms of sort of Canada, it is seen as playing a real role, right? In which, we're a middle power and there are challenges in many issues around the world. But on this issue, and I think, I suspect Kathleen will nod her head when I say this, this is one of those issues where Canada really does have a voice on the global stage in my observation as I travel the world talking about these programs. But Trevor, I want to bring you get empowered, brilliant women on the stage. There's no room for a guy like you.
Not at all.
In this sort of conversation. But I want to get you to that, which is the way it should be, by the way. I want to get you in. When I go up to Capitol Hill, Trevor, in Washington, and I talk about these programs, you won't get 100% head nods about but in general, I would say 90% of the members up there at least know about these programs. They may not know them in depth, but they know about the programs, and in fact, it's one of the few issues in Washington where there remains really bipartisan support across political parties for these programs. I suspect that if I went up to Parliament Hill right now and walked around, you don't have to answer this question directly, and talk to MPs, they would have no clue, most of them would have no clue that these programs even exist, despite the really significant investment that the Canadian taxpayer has put into it. So why should people care about the global partnership? Give us a little bit of a 30,000-foot level view here.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for being here. A special thanks to our colleagues from the United States who've made the trip. Ambassador Jenkins, lovely to see you again, and Kathleen and Todd. Your presence really is, as Cindy mentioned earlier, it indicates just how much this partnership is not about one country. It's why the Global Partnership was launched. The U.S. had been doing cooperative threat reduction for a decade before the Global Partnership was launched. The wisdom of Senators Nunn and Lugar, who launched this program as the Soviet Union was crumbling in 1991, was really extraordinary. And it was only 10 years later, following the terror attacks of 9/11, that there was a recognition that, as great as those efforts were, it wasn't enough. And I think, Brian, this goes to your point about why is the global partnership important. It is so poorly understood what happens in the world of WMD proliferation, because you don't have countries out there sticking up their hand saying, I'm a proliferator. Everything that is being done discreetly, is being done to defy intelligence services, it is being done to violate international conventions. And this has been going on for decades. This is not new with the global partnership. The Soviet Union launched their offensive biological weapons program the same month that the BTWC was signed and they became a depository state, because it gave them what they considered a hall pass to cheat. When it comes to the issue of why the program matters, it really does go back to this question that Sabine spoke of, which is prevention. And it's something that we have never lost sight of in the global partnership community, whether that is Canada or more broadly. And we recite often the initial line from the Kananaskis statement, where G8 leaders came together on June 27th, 2002, and said that they were creating the global partnership to prevent terrorists in states that harbor them from acquiring and using weapons and materials of mass destruction. They didn't say respond to. They said prevent. And prevention, at times, isn't that sexy. It can be when you are going into Syria and pulling out chemical weapons and taking them onto a U.S. ship in the middle of the Mediterranean to destroy them. That gets big billing. But the day-to-day work that we do behind the scenes to accomplish prevention, in part, it's not headline grabbing. In part, it's because we can't grab the headlines. The things we are doing, we don't want to point attention to. We're also a bit of a victim of our own success. And it would be disingenuous of me to sit here and say that there hasn't been a large-scale WMD attack since the global partnership came into being, though we have seen repeated use of certain weapons of mass destruction, most notably chemical. But that, again, it doesn't mean that the efforts that we have done haven't been the lead factor for that. You can't deny the fact that the elimination of 40,000 metric tons of Russian chemical weapons stored in more than 5 million munitions made a massive contribution to global peace and security. I've had very difficult conversation with certain international colleagues about the work that Canada did in Russia. We have been accused by one of our very close allies of having destroyed the junk while they kept the good stuff. I saw the junk. That may have come out really wrong. Let's lighten things up a little. I saw the chemical weapons junk, as did my colleagues Natalie Sombla and Natalie Spears, who we all worked on the construction of the Shucha and Kiesner chemical weapons destruction facilities. It wasn't one or two. Shucha alone in the Ural Mountains, 1.9 million munitions. And there's an infamous picture of Senator Richard Lugar at the Shucha chemical weapons destruction facility in the mid-1990s with 2 of the 88 millimeter CW shells containing VX in his briefcase. So don't tell me that the elimination of that junk didn't stop bad things from happening at a time when the borders in Russia and former Soviet Union were borders in name only. When states such as Syria, the DPRK, Iran were actively building up their programs. What I have learned in almost 25 years of doing this is terrorists and states of proliferation concern want the path of least resistance. If something's easy, they'll take the easy road. Who wouldn't? And I think, Brian, again, back to the question of why isn't this more known? Because, thanks to the GP and some good fortune, we've not seen a major incident. But let's think what happened when we do see incidents. Before the global partnership was created, how much did the 1995 use of VX in the Tokyo subway cost the Japanese economy? Don't expect anyone to know the answers. It's measurable in GDP lost. How much did COVID cost the global economy? And I'm not sitting here suggesting that was deliberate. But if it had been, and it could have been, what was that cost? There isn't a person on this planet who wasn't affected. We need to do a better job connecting the dots between the potential and the impacts and where we have seen the devastation in the past, and not just to lives lost, but to economies. We need to connect those dots to raise awareness that these challenges are persistent as we see the global crises that are unfolding around us. Most notably in Russia. Of course, we've seen the tragedy of the past few days in the Middle East. WMD is relevant in all of these contexts. and the work of the global partnership to make sure that those who would have the interest, the ability, the capacity to use it, have less available to them, is where the global partnership has demonstrated its enduring value for 21 years.
So I want to press you just a little bit, Trevor, on this point in terms of kind of the knowledge of, let's say, the political leaders, on MPs and others across the Canadian government. I mean, you're right that the very nature of these programs is that, if you are successful, nothing happens, right? Which is difficult to therefore, sell and market. But as I mentioned, it's not just because Ambassador Jenkins is much more charming than you are, but if you look down in the United States, they seem to have done a much better job of kind of permeating the successes of these programs to those that need to know, and even to the wider public. So what are we doing wrong here that the Americans are getting more right?
I retire in 4 years and 10 months. I'll have a different answer to this at that time. Seriously though, we do take enormous pride in the fact that the global partnership was Canada-born. In an extraordinary partnership between the United States and Canada, following the 9/11 terror attacks, to sell the GP to the entire G8 community at the time. This event, thank you to Professor Manilak in Carleton, to my knowledge, is the first dedicated event on the global partnership in Canada since Kananaskis. Mm-hmm. Why? I think there's a few reasons. And back to your question about our politicians and their priorities. The global partnership and the weapons threat reduction program, I say this without hubris, is a well-oiled machine. We've been doing this for a long time. We have an extraordinary team that does it. We've had exceptional leadership. You've heard from two of our former leaders, Sabine and our Associate Deputy Minister, who have championed us and given us the latitude that we need to build up the expertise, to go where the threats are greatest. So we're not a problem. And often it's the problems today that get the attention, when something is broken and needs to be fixed. The global partnership has been serving this role. And it's not that we are neglected. Our Prime Minister was in the Southeast Asia a few weeks ago for the ASEAN Summit. The only security deliverable were two major projects from the global partnership. One on the biological side, the renewal of our highly successful mitigation of biological threats program, and a project on the nuclear side. So it's not that our leaders don't see it. It is that this, for whatever reason, this subject of weapons of mass destruction proliferation has really been pushed down to us at the expert level, and it rarely rises up to the leader level. I can't tell you why that is, wearing my current hat. I have some suspicion, but I would say a couple of things. Number one, it's scary. Weapons of mass destruction is not a good time. You heard Cindy say in her remarks, what these things can do. It's horrific. And a lot of Canadians, a lot of our leaders, prefer, quite frankly, to think, what, we're dealing with that over here. I went into the Wayback Machine before this event, and I pulled out a survey that the department conducted in 2005 on Canada's relationship with Russia, and specifically about the work that we were doing through the global partnership. Bear in mind, this is 3 years after the launch of the GPI Kananaskis, only 4 years after the 9/11 terror attacks. These issues were still front and center shortly after Iraq and WMD. So these were issues highlighted in the newspaper on a daily basis. At that time, 90% of Canadians had never heard of the global partnership. That's bad, but 82% of respondents, when they were told about it, thought it was the greatest thing, said it must continue. And then 95% said, but don't tell us about it again. That continues. I think it is comforting for the government to know that we are here, that we do what we do. When we've had to go to Treasury Board or to other partners to justify our existence, They listen intently. They say when we leave that they won't sleep for a week. But we've had that support. So I don't want to call it benign neglect, but the fact that we're not having a spotlight shone on us every day by our leaders, we're okay with that. It fits with the work that we do. But there is a time and a place where our government, where our leaders, our politicians, and our public who pay our bills, who pay our salaries and give us the money to do the work, they need to be aware that this is happening, and they need to appreciate just how much money, how many lives, how much chaos a program like ours can help to stop from happening.
It's
So-
almost like we're the sin eaters. You know, there's one of the Bourne movies used that phrase, we're the sin eaters. The security people that do the really difficult work that nobody wants to talk about. But if you don't do it, things just fall apart.
So I want to come back to you, not now, and pulse you a little bit, Trevor, on some of the success. Same question I asked Sabine, just in terms of some of the successes, but also some of the, because it was Sabine referenced it in some of your work that you have done, especially on the biological weapons front, that intersects with some global public health issues. You brought up COVID. I want to come back to you a little bit on that, but first, Kathleen, I want to get you back into the conversation. And obviously, the United States was back in 2002 instrumental. This is Bush administration years, instrumental in helping to bring together and launch the global partnership. So I wonder if you could. So looking back now through the history of the GP, you've been doing this for a while. What is the value, the enduring value, that Washington sees in the global partnership?
Sure. So happy to. I mean, we've talked about it already today. I mean, I think in short, we're stronger when we work together, as opposed to just working by ourselves. And the global partnership definitely provides that. I think taking a collective response to WMD threats in a way that's as comprehensive as possible. If I were to just put it in a short, succinct sentence. I also think that one of the great things about the global partnership and one of the enduring values is it's the information sharing that goes on. These forums are actually very informal. That's one of the great benefits of the global partnership. It's not very overly stuffy. Yes, we have our meetings, but a lot of work gets done on the margins at the coffee breaks, and there's a lot of information sharing both within the meetings themselves and then outside. And I'm talking about information that's important to help us predict and understand what that threat landscape might be going forward. It's also helpful to understand what members' priorities are. Where do they want to spend their funding? And that allows us to go in and plug in, right? So that we're filling in the piece of the puzzle. So that information sharing on priorities, but also information sharing on their perceived threats, right? What are they worried about? And so that's particularly helpful as we're trying to identify, and we've already talked about it today, the need to look at emerging threats. And I would even say over the horizon threats. What are the threats that we're not even able to imagine right now? And I think the global partnership definitely provides that forum. Another thing, and this is at the very practical level that it has been in my experience, is that the global partnership, and I just kind of touched on this, is very working level. So it's, yes, definitely has a delegation come, it's very senior, and we have an air of formality to it. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that are there that are just working on capacity building programming within their own countries. And so just bringing those people together, it's almost like a CBRN convention in a way. It's kind of a quirky way to look at it, but it's a great way to bring countries together so that you can identify who has shared priorities, who has shared perceived threats, who has funding, and how can we put these resources towards the threats. And I'll give you a quick anecdote, which I really love, just stemming from the most recent, the last German meeting at the end of 2022. Literally at a coffee break, we were talking, my delegation and I, we were talking with some folks from the EU, Norway, and the UK. And within a matter of, say, 10 to 15 minutes, we were able to commit, notionally, of course, we'd go back to capitals and whatnot, but commit probably anywhere from $5 to $7 million of funding for Ukraine, right there at a coffee break. And it was really remarkable. And so, I think that kind of working level relationship oriented body has a lot of value. We can talk about the more formal non-proliferation regimes. The U.S. obviously remains committed to those, but definitely, as those become more challenging to work in, I think global partnership and other like-minded forums where we have like-minded partners working together, it's going to be extremely helpful for us to advance these ideas of peace and security. So I'll leave it at that.
So let me ask you this, Kathleen. So Sabine brought up money, so let's go down that path. And obviously the United States has been, since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, investing in programs. We didn't call it the global partnership in the earliest days. It was cooperative threat reduction, trying to build down the nuclear, chemical, and biological stockpiles of the former states of the former Soviet Union. So the U.S. spends, even to this day, I believe, more money than all the other partners combined on these programs, including through the global partnership. So why do you need Canada? Why do you need these partners?
Why don't we need Canada, really? I mean, in addition to the fact that Canada has been, and we talked about it already, definitely the leader within the global partnership from the very, very onset, and to which the United States is extremely grateful for. Canada serves as a huge catalyst for change, a catalyst for big ideas. Just to name a couple off the top of my head, during our presidency, the Canadians identified the Biosecurity Signature Initiative in Africa as a way for GP members to come together and fund WMD threat reduction on the continent of Africa. That kind of change, that kind of leadership is essential. We can't do it alone. It goes back to we're stronger when we're together. We absolutely can't do it alone. Another great example of Canadian leadership, which the U.S. is very grateful for, although it's still in its kind of burgeoning stage right now, is Canada's efforts to counter disinformation through the global partnership. We're very, very supportive of this idea, and Canada has brought to the table a great idea on how we might have a more comprehensive approach to countering disinformation from several countries. I could list several examples of the types of leadership and thought change that Canada has brought to the table, not to mention the $1.7 billion of funding, which is no small feat. So definitely, we wouldn't be here without Canada, to be sure. So we're grateful, and I hope that kind of answers your question on that.
I want to come back to you actually on because you raised Russia, and I want to talk to you about China as well. So I'm going to come back to you in 1 second, but before we leave kind of sort of successes, and I want to get back to political challenges and also some of the sort of meddlesome challenges at the international stage, because you now have this kind of great bird's eye view, Kathleen, on global cooperation on these issues. But Trevor, let me really quickly come back to you. And just have you tick off maybe really the same question that I asked Cindy. Sort of the big successes, as you were there at the beginning. What are some of the big, in your mind, successes that that you have witnessed, just in terms of sort of Canada's investment specifically, and then more broadly on the global partnership?
Cindy summed it up very well when she said wherever there has been progress on the NACD front for the past 20 plus years, the global partnership fingerprints have been all over it. Chemical weapons destruction in Russia, it doesn't happen without the global partnership. Russia was explicit about that when we were discussing it as a G8 community in the lead up to Kananaskis. There was no way that they would ever have the resources to accomplish the destruction of their chemical weapons stocks. Again, we spoke of the numbers, 40,000 metric tons, 5.4 million munitions, 7 different sites across the vastness of Russia. The global partnership stepped up in an extraordinary way. One of the real success stories of that bears repetition here is we speak often about the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, which were the 3 big players in the construction of that facility, along with Russia. 11 countries contributed through the United Kingdom's program. 11. Now, some were relatively modest, a few tens of thousands, up to, in Canada's case, $103 million. We put aside ego, we put aside flags, and we focus on the objective. And this is what we are trying to create now with the global partnership again. A reminder that you don't have to have a multi-billion-dollar budget in the case of the United States, or $74 million in the case of Canada. Whatever you have matters. So we need to remind ourselves of some of those early successes. I won't pretend to speak of the many successes on the nuclear side because I'm largely ignorant of them. My colleague Natalie is the expert. But I'll speak on the biological side for a moment, because I think this is an area where the global partnership has done some of its heaviest and hardest lifting. How do you mitigate biological weapons threats and bioterrorism threats when you don't actually have an international organization that's dedicated to that job? Sabine used to be our representative at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. An incredibly robust technical secretariat there. People who can go out and put their boots on the ground, to verify the destruction of chemical weapons. Similarly with the International Atomic Energy Agency. There is an organization of hundreds of people. The biological side, there's an implementation support unit that has 4 people. And they have 4 since last December. Before that, it was 3. 3 people. And the convention is so extraordinarily broad, and it has an important norm that was spoken of, which is biological weapons are repugnant to the conscience of mankind, but it doesn't have any teeth. So the global partnership provided the teeth. When others were sitting on the sidelines and watching, we stepped up and did. And while some of the most obvious proliferation threats have been beyond our reach thus far, let's not kid ourselves. The Russian biological weapons machine that was so active during the Soviet period didn't stop. We just can't find it. We can't do anything about it because we don't have the ability to go there. So we went where we knew programs like the Soviet program, programs like Shinrikyo went to start their programs, Africa and Asia. I mentioned in a comment earlier about yesterday's WMD problems. And there's no bigger yesterday problem that continues to haunt us today than disease. There's no such thing as naturally occurring VX, or any chemical weapon for that matter, or a nuclear weapon. A weapon of mass destruction all originate from naturally occurring disease. The seed stock for every biological weapons program to date has been nature. The Soviet Union had what was called the anti-plague system, and it was vast, and there were tens of thousands of people who worked in it. And they went around the world and they harvested outbreaks. You know what? You go to Zaire during the first outbreak of Ebola, and yes, you send people who are going to help end that outbreak. But what do they go home with in their suitcase? Strains of Ebola that they take into the bioweapons labs. These challenges haven't stopped. So if we want to stop the terrorists and the proliferators from acquiring new and ever more deadly pathogens, we need to be ahead of the game when it comes to disease surveillance, detection, and building capacity so that an outbreak doesn't become a proliferation event. The Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014-15, we all know how terrible that was, and that 11,000 citizens, primarily of 3 countries in West Africa, perished. 29,000 were infected. The world was fixed on this huge problem, and we threw all of our public health might at trying to stop it, which was a wonderful thing. 300,000 samples of Ebola were left behind in unlocked facilities in 3 countries that didn't have the ability to deal with it. You need 1 sample to create a global killing biological weapons arsenal. 1. And there were 300,000 left behind. So we're still, the global partnership community, cleaning up the mess on aisle 5. What we are trying to do now is stop having to do that type of post-facto cleanup and working with partners around the world, such as Africa CDC, the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, to build biosafety and biosecurity into outbreak response so that you're not left with this legacy of threat, and that the capacity that we build is going to have what we call dual benefit. We often talk in our community about dual use, how things that are ostensibly for good can be used for bad. We talk about dual benefit. Public health people, animal health people use our security money. We have no problem building capacity for you to stop naturally occurring disease, but our objective will never be, will never move away from that fundamental goal of the global partnership, which is prevention of terrorists and states from acquiring and using those materials. So many examples, Brian, of great successes. I think one of the only one of the failures of the global partnership, and something we grapple with to this day, is what a bad job we've done telling the world about it.
I want to go back to Sabine, but just quickly, 30 seconds or less. You mentioned COVID. How did Canada's investments on biosecurity help in COVID response?
Labs that we built in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Jordan, in the Caribbean were all put on the front lines of COVID response in their respective nations. They were converted from labs that were doing whatever they were to labs that were the primary care facilities and primary detection sites as COVID samples were pouring in. In Southeast Asia, where SARS-CoV-2 was born, of course, our partners in the ASEAN region, through a project that we have together with them and a partner in Canada called Blue Dot, one of the great success stories of technology out of our country. It's a big data disease surveillance platform. We're able to anticipate, as we believe SARS-CoV-2 was still contained in China, they were able to anticipate the first 6 cities that COVID was going to strike in the ASEAN region so that they could throw their resources at those particular sites, those airports, to try to keep it out, to try to mitigate it. And also, again, I know I'm over 30 seconds, but it is also worth noting that our program has unique capabilities that in times of crisis, our government relies on. So as the world was scrambling to acquire personal protective equipment, because of the work that we do, we had pipelines that already existed. So we were able to acquire materials that not only benefited the government of Canada, but that we were able to rapidly deploy to our partners around the world, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, to help them. At the time, we were hoping that we would be able to stop COVID in its tracks, as of course has been shown. That simply wasn't possible.
Sabine, I want to go back to you because you can answer this question. And you can tell us what this guy's not telling us. So when I pressed him on some of the political challenges, at least in this country, with respect to kind of marketing the global partnership investments, which again are remarkable more broadly. So he talked about the secretive nature of the programs. I agree with that. He talked about the challenge of proving a negative, right? Absolutely. He talked about, these are scary things that, the general public doesn't necessarily want to know about. What is he not telling us?
What's he not? I think he's put his fingers on it, but what he can't really say is the different attitudes in different governments to spending money, including spending money on security issues. It is no surprise to me that the indeterminate extension of the WMD threat program was done under a Liberal government. We are probably looking at a change in government next time, and I am waiting with bated breath to see what happens to that indeterminate funding, because it is still at the whim of the government. They can say, you don't have to come back to us every 5 years, but they can say, you end next Tuesday. That is always in the power of the government. So that is my fear, that in the name of saving money, governments know that votes reside in the domestic sphere. The first thing that always gets cut is international activities. Development money goes, because there's no immediate tangible benefit for the Canadian public. If you were to explain it to them, they would, yeah, that makes sense, because that can all come back to us. And why are we pouring money into Ukraine? Well, excuse me, there's a war in Europe. The last time we had one of those, Canada was very much involved. And if this thing spreads, we're gonna be very much involved, it's gonna come home. So you explain it to the public, they get it. The problem is explanations take more than 280 characters. And we are now in a political era where politicians respond to tweets or xeets or whatever they call it these days. And I've seen that. I've seen ministers traveling, so I'm gonna go travel to X. I got something that I can announce. And I travel on Monday. And I'm not making this up, okay? 48 hours, I want to announce something worth $6 million worth. Well, I mean, threat reduction isn't a hostess gift. It's something that actually needs to be planned out. It needs to be thoughtfully and strategically applied, but that requires long-term thinking. If you're in an environment, a political environment, where it's like this, do it now. There was a tweet yesterday, I gotta have an answer. That makes the work really difficult, and that isn't going away. And I have found that certain types of governments respond much more to the immediate need, to the visibility, than they do to the long term. And I mean, our current government is not much better at that. Image is a lot, and security doesn't lend itself to image unless you're responding to a fire and you're coming with the hose, but that's not prevention. So those are the challenges, I think, that Trevor alluded to, but I mean, here they are. It's a daily reality for public servants, is that some of the programs and ideas and strategies, and I say strategy deliberately because strategy is always something that operates in the longer term, doesn't sell at the political level. It just doesn't, and that's a huge challenge that we have.
So thanks for this, Sabine. Kathleen, you're going to lift us out of grubby Canadian politics here, and I want to ask you a question back on the international stage. But I want to warn you all, we're going to turn to questions here. So if you have questions, you should line up at the microphones now. But before we do that, please feel free to move around. Kathleen, we thought the Cold War was over, and that nukes were a relic of the Cold War, and now here we are. Right, we're witnessing obviously the tragic events in Ukraine, elsewhere around the world. Trevor mentioned Russia. China has come up a little bit earlier, I think maybe even in Cindy's, in the Associate Deputy Minister's remarks. Is there a place for, we spent a lot of time talking about cooperation and collaboration and the partners across the G7 and how we're collaborating. But we have two actors internationally, Russia. Some would put China, I think, into that category as well, that have been accused from time to time on let's just say, working against the interests of the wider global partnership. Is there space for a global partnership in a world where two, large powers are working against the interests of cooperative non-proliferation?
I would answer that in one word, and that is absolutely. In fact, I think there has never been a better time for the global partnership. It is more important than ever because of what you just mentioned. Certainly, global partnership members will continue through their own actions, continue to affirm and reinforce those international norms that some countries think are optional. I would also submit that the activities of the global partnership, the capacity building activities of the global partnership, I know the US views this very much so, when we go into countries or in regions, Africa, Southeast Asia, we are filling gaps. We're going in and we're identifying where the threats are, what the gaps are, and how we can help them in a productive way. But if it weren't for the members of the global partnership, who do you think would be filling those gaps, right? The Russias, China, et cetera. So I think that's it proves the point, it proves the value of the global partnership. At the beginning, we talked about the enduring value. I think that's one of it. The ability to go in and counter the capacity building, if you want to call it that, in quotes, capacity building assistance that might be provided. I think putting global partnership members in there is extremely valuable, and I think that's the way forward as it relates to global partnership with regard to that question, Trevor.
Proliferators hate the global partnership. UN Security Council Resolution 1540. The people who are on the committee aren't allowed to come to global partnership meetings because 2 members of the Security Council have a veto and won't let them come because they don't like them talking to us. Proliferators launch aggressive disinformation campaign against the cooperative threat reduction work of members of the global partnership. Canada, a decade ago, Sabine and I know all too well the impacts of that, work we did in the Kyrgyz Republic. The United States, especially though, work that it has supported in Georgia for years and now in Ukraine. The proliferators are calling it out to try to turn the script. I think though one of the best perspectives I've had on this from a proliferator was from Iran. The BTWC review conference last fall. They were growing increasingly frustrated by the fact that they couldn't stop us. They're used to, in these consensus-based organizations, simply be able to say, no, we don't agree, so no one can do anything. We said, well, don't agree here, we're just going to do it over here. And at one point, when I made that, a very similar comment to that from the floor, the Iranian head of delegation quipped, well, the global partnership can do it because they'll do it anyway. And that's quite right, we will.
Can I just add
Sabine,
something?
please.
China was mentioned. China is a real challenge because on some levels in the non-proliferation world, they're actually quite cooperative. On others, not so much. At the very beginning of my tenure as Director General, a bunch of us went to Beijing. Tim was there, Trevor was there, I think Natalie, you were there as well. And I remember that the one thing that I took away from that, they were all very polite and everything. They listened kindly and they said, yeah, maybe not right now. But one of the things, somebody said something, and that really stuck with me, and it was, we don't control our chemical weapons, our chemical industry. And the Chinese are nothing if not practical. So they knew that their chemical industry doesn't understand the chemical weapons convention and the obligations they're under, and they send their stuff wherever. Now, you take that forward, and I took it forward to The Hague, and there the Chinese were very recalcitrant to create the investigative and attribution mechanism. Why? My personal theory, I have nothing, no intel, nothing to base this on, but my theory is because probably Chinese fingerprints were all over the weapons that Syria was using. And it wasn't because China deliberately put them there, but they couldn't stop them from going there. And they didn't want to have that exposed. So on the chemical side, the Chinese are really, on the nuclear side, however, I think they're a much more valuable contributor. And they did, at one point, create a nuclear center for excellence for nuclear security outside Beijing. And I went to the facility to have a look at it. But could we get a Canadian government to co-fund something with China that might reach partners that we as Canada could not reach, say Pakistan. Pakistan, I mean, they have a nuclear industry, and my God, it's held together with chewing gum and razor wire. So there would be a real, I think, place for us to work. But could we work with China? Can you imagine the story in the Globe and Mail? So there are political challenges in terms of non-traditional partners that you might actually achieve something with that we cannot overcome, and that is also a reality. I mean, we would Africa. We've done fantastic work in Africa. Does it sell in Canada? Does Joe Q Public think we really need to be in Africa? I mean, what's in it for us? Well, you can explain it in more than 280 characters. But again, it's a political challenge to be active in countries that Canadians and Canadian politicians don't appreciate as being necessary partners. But that's where the global partnership comes in, because there are other partners within the global partnership that can do that work, and we can farm it out. Like, I think Kathy would agree that we can talk to people the Americans can't, because the Americans are always assumed, they come with all this baggage, and we don't have the baggage, so we can go to places that they can't, but we still have our own limitations as well.
No, that's a great anecdote, Sabine, and it reminds me of one of the early programs, and Trevor, maybe I'll make you speak to this. You referenced the Sucha chemical destruction facility that was obviously heavily invested in by multiple partners, but particularly the United States. And when that facility, as I understand it, was built some distance from where the weapons were actually stored. And the Americans were, now Kathleen will have no idea when I say this, sometimes there's a large bureaucracy in Washington. She's never experienced that, obviously. But sometimes it's the case. And there was a challenge. Obviously, you had to get the munitions from one place to another. And as it turned out, the money that was being drawn to build the facility, they couldn't use it in order to transport the weapons. So tell us what happened.
Shucha, small town east of the Ural Mountains, a couple hours drive from Chelyabinsk. The chemical weapons storage facility, where you had the 5.4 metric tons of CW stored in the nearly 2 million munitions, was here for very good reasons. The chemical weapons destruction facility that was to be built was 33 kilometers away. Now, the way that the U.S. congressional funding worked at that time is it was for everything within the perimeter of the CWDF, the destruction facility. So you have munitions over here, 33 kilometers or roughly 18, 19 miles away was where they needed to get to. So this is where the support from the international community was critical. One of Canada's earliest projects is we built a railway with our funding directed through the United Kingdom, and with a really important contribution from a partner who's not here today, but who should be acknowledged for their early leadership, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, an NGO co-founded by Ted Turner of CNN fame and Senator Nunn, who I mentioned earlier. They gave us $1 million that we programmed, and it built a bridge across the river. That wasn't the only issue, though. It was a gas pipeline. If you're going to destroy that many chemical weapons, a process that took years and years and years, you need a massive amount of energy. Well, the U.S. was building the facility, but they couldn't plug it into anything. So together with the UK and other donors, we built gas pipelines. I think the gas pipeline was actually 105 kilometers. We built an electrical substation. We built a local public address system so that if something went terribly wrong at the facility, that those in the community would be notified. And our efforts weren't restricted to outside of the CWDF. One of the, I think, very prudent things that the U.S. program did at the time is said, Russia, a lot of this is your responsibility. We're not going to fully foot the bill for something that you have an obligation to do, which is destroy these chemical weapons that you built. So the U.S. funding was restricted to one of two main destruction buildings. The Russians at the time made a very compelling case to Canada and others that we just don't have the money. And we will do it eventually, but it's going to take a really long time. Couldn't wait. So we helped put the guts in the second destruction facility together with other partners. So it's a really excellent example of the complementarity and of partners coming together as we have continued to do for the past 2 decades to figure out, all right, none of us is capable of doing this on their own, so let's find what you can do better than we, or that a niche that we can fill. Again, a very modest example. The U.S. is working with Interpol to do a series of really excellent chemical security events for law enforcement officers. Because of congressional funding, they're not able to actually pay for the hospitality side. Well, you know what? The folks aren't going to show up if there's no hospitality. So the U.S. is doing 99% of the heavy lifting. We went in and paid for catering. But without the catering, the people don't show up to the event. And there are many, many other examples that we could give of that type of partnership between us and others.
Well, All right, microphones are open. I would love to hear, particularly from students, if you have, sir, we want to hear from you as well, please. Professor Hanson.
Nice to see you again.
You, sir.
3 comments. 1, the marketing problem. I would say it starts with the name of the program. It doesn't convey what you're doing, and anybody in the marketing business would tell you names do matter. Secondly, when it comes to a new government, which may come sooner rather than later, I think framing what you're doing under the rubric of national security or international security is going to be enormously important. Thirdly, you've talked about Canadian public sensibilities and not scaring them. Well, maybe it's time the Canadian public woke up to the fact that they do live in a dangerous world. And programs like this are important when it comes to addressing their national security. China. Sabine, with all due respect, I would not start with China if you're briefing a new conservative government.
I know.
Nor would I suggest that you necessarily want to name the program after John Baird. But I do think names do matter, and maybe it's time for a rebranding.
Professor Hanson, thank you. Trevor.
Thank you, Professor Hanson. We speak often in the global partnership about the critical role of vocabulary. The global partnership against the spread of weapons and materials of mass destruction. The latter part of our name tells a story. The first part, which is the abbreviation, doesn't. Google global partnership. There's a new one born almost every week, and usually you get one about banking, about food security, a lot of good global partnership, but there's only one global partnership that deals with weapons of mass destruction. We realize this branding problem internally. Our program used to be the Global Partnership Program, GPP. When we were being extended indeterminately, a very wise decision was taken to rename the program Weapons Threat Reduction Program, so that it would better communicate internally what our job was about. But you're quite right. When we talk about the work we do and we use global partnership shorthand, we don't tell our story.
Let's take a couple of rapid fire questions. Grant, this is alumni at Stimson Center, by the way. And then Ben, we'll go to you as well. We'll take these 2 together. Hear me?
Grant, current student at NIPSIA. I was just wondering, as Brian alluded to earlier, there's quite a difference between the understanding of the global partnership in Washington and Ottawa. He said that a lot of the time you go to MPs downtown, they have no idea what it is. Could you kind of explain some of the details as to why there's such a discrepancy between the understanding in Canada and the United States?
We're going to hold that for 1 second. And Kathleen, I'm going to bring you into that. So some of the experience as well, just in terms of the U.S. So I want to turn to the 2 of you to give a little bit more reflection on that question. And then I'm going to go to you, Kathleen, for what are the Americans doing better than we are? Not better than we are in your estimation, but what is the process in terms of congressional engagement? But before we do that, write that question down so you don't forget. Ben.
Good day, my name is Ben. I'm a first-year NIPSIA student, and I really like the kind of thoughts on the navigating policy and government challenges throughout the years. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit what strategies did you use to more like convince policymakers? What kind of elements worked towards convincing them that the program was useful and needed to be kept alive? And then is the program, the way it's built right now, flexible enough to adapt to the Canadian foreign policy as it changes through the years without having to always go back and make changes to the program as it is?
Great questions. 3 great questions. So I'm actually going to reverse this, and I'm going to go to Kathleen first. And let's take, there was a little bit sort of Ben's first question and Graham's question are a little bit similar. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the experience looks like back in Washington, Kathleen, about engaging on Capitol Hill and policymakers more generally. What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, hopefully I can answer that question sufficiently and satisfactorily. Just kind of off the top of my head, the first thing I would offer is this? WMD threat reduction, international security enjoys bipartisan support in Washington. We're not necessarily held hijack as much as maybe other countries, depending upon who is in office. That's one of the nice things about definitely the politics in the United States they whipsaw back and forth. I totally appreciate that. But one of the things that I feel has been somewhat insulated from that is WMD threat reduction. So that would be one thing I would offer up. I think another really good explanation to your question as to why in the United States it's different, it could be this. I think it'd be worth actually really thinking long and hard about it. But one thing that also occurs to me is that the U.S. interagency, so many departments and agencies within the United States play a role in WMD threat reduction. And as such, the global partnership. Just to give you a quick idea, the delegation that goes to the global partnership meetings, and sometimes we almost kind of smirk a little bit out of embarrassment, but not very much. It's kind of a sorry, not sorry kind of a thing. We have 25 people wanting to go to these meetings from the U.S. interagency. So what that means is that there is leadership at every single within those departments and agencies working with Capitol Hill, working with our congressional appropriators, making sure that the money for this WMD threat reduction is allocated. And just the overall reputation of the global partnership, I think because of that, is just more known. I'll kind of stop there. I'll probably continue to think about it, but I definitely would point to those two factors as to what's going on in the United States, and it's a pretty popular delegation to get on. I'll put it that way.
Kathleen, I want to take the second part of Ben's question. What arguments work? So get off the top of your head, like what is the best argument that you could make to a member of Congress?
Yeah, well, I think the professor made a really good point, and I think that our those that go and testify in front of Congress, which I am not one, I don't think that there's any fear of scaring the American public. To a degree, I think it's not so much that we are putting it in the newspapers as to what could happen. But I think that there's a pretty clear drumbeat as to the importance and the gravity and the horrificness of WMD and the use of WMD. And I think everybody has a pretty keen understanding of that. Even anecdotally, when I talk with people, just friends, everybody kind of knows, at least who I know, they know what a weapon of mass destruction is, just because there's a general awareness of it. So I think if I were to quickly answer your question, although again I should give it consideration certainly to be more satisfactory, I don't think that we're as afraid to frighten those congressional appropriators, and I think that there's a really good messaging that goes on from our senior leadership within the Department of State, within the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, to make sure that everybody fully understands what those threats are.
Yep, helpful.
Yeah.
Sabine, really, I want to collect some more questions here as well.
Yeah.
So really briefly,
Yeah,
where is Trevor falling down in his job? Why don't have
Well, he isn't, because the processes in the U.S., you mentioned the appropriators. The U.S. goes through these painful annual, semi-annual, whatever, I don't know your system that well, but you have these regular appropriation processes where every budget gets regurgitated and discussed and analyzed, et cetera, et cetera. So when you want to have your threat reduction money on an annual basis, you have to go back to Congress and educate them about it. We don't have that. Once we have our money, it's there. And now that we're indeterminate, it'll be there for theoretically ever. So we have no need to engage MPs, and our government doesn't see the need to reach across the aisle for education on these processes. I think that's just a systemic issue that we have. We could put on education sessions for parliamentarians. They would probably be well intended, but those things take quite a bit of political lift to get going and started, and there isn't the interest in that.
Kathleen, I'm sorry, Sabine.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that I think since I've been a public servant, in the early days of my public service career in the 90s, I was often included in briefings to parliamentarians from the opposition party to get them to understand things that the government was doing. That hasn't happened for 15 years, 18 years. It just doesn't happen anymore.
Kathleen, I want to give you and Trevor both 15 seconds.
Well, just to say that you're absolutely right, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we are compelled within the U.S. government to go to the appropriators, the Office of Management Budget in particular, and I just participated in a briefing a few weeks ago on that, on what we're going to be doing with our funding every single year. So we just had a meeting, and this is anecdotal, about what our office is going to be doing in 2025, and we highlight those things that aren't terribly rosy, that are extremely threat-oriented. And that consistent drumbeat, I think, is also a really big difference. So thank you for saying that.
There was a question about flexibility. And simply want to say one of the hallmarks of our program is flexibility. Sabine noted earlier that we basically built a blank check into the extension of the GP to say wherever the threats go, whatever the WMD threats are, we have the capacity to deal with those. And it has given us a great deal of prominence in times of crisis. When the government's looking around, it's like, how do we do that? Very, very often, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is North Korea, whether it is COVID, Ebola, our program becomes the first line of response.
Thanks, Trevor. All right, we've got 10 minutes. We're going to get these 4 questions in. You're going to write this down because you'll never remember. You'll never remember these questions. Write these down so we make sure that we get them all. Let's start here, and we'll just ping pong back and forth. We'll collect all 4, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond. Sir.
Thank you for all your great insights. I really enjoyed the presentation. You mentioned about how the GP, why it's not in politicians, they don't pay much interest to it. And I do believe that we're in Canada in a privileged position where strategically or geostrategically, we're away from all the chaos and instability caused by WMDs. But the fact that Canadians are privileged to be in such a position, it does play a role in funding and how GP gets that. Do you believe that working with economists and other government agencies can perhaps help spread the importance and to gain funding for a situation like this? Thank you.
Good question. Wait, before you walk away, tell us who you are and...
Sorry, my name's Ali. I'm from the IPIS, Infrastructure Protection and International Security, and Master's in Engineering. Yeah.
Thanks, Ali. Thank you. Sir?
Hi, thank you everyone, and thank you for mentioning disinformation. I would be curious to hear you talk a little bit to Facebook's role in the Rohingya genocide and any policy successes you've had in avoiding a sort of repeat of that. And I am Alex from NIPSIA. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Sir?
Hi, my name is Mitchell Clark. I'm a first-year NIPSIA master's student. My question is more just related to the GP's role as it interacts with other treaty regimes, particularly the recent sort of falling apart of the INF and Open Skies treaties, given there is some overlap on the nuclear side. What role would the GP play in filling those gaps? And does bilateral engagement between the United States and Russia still count for more?
Great question. Sir?
Hello, good morning. I'm Alfonso Vera from the Embassy of Mexico. So I just wanted to ask, Mexico has been a champion always of disarmament, but I feel like there's an exhaustion on the younger generations. They feel like it's an ongoing, never-ending work that doesn't have so many rewards. And it's the diplomats who keep the issue on the agenda, but the politicians, they really don't care about it. And to some degree, that's because they respond to what the citizens, the constituents care about. And in Mexico, we know the weapons of mass destruction are an impending, peril. But we have other things, that more pressing to us, like immigration and narco traffic, arms trafficking, etc., etc. How can we do, or what can we do to keep the subject on the agenda? What do you think we should do to convince not only the politicians but the citizens that this is something that we should keep doing?
Excellent. Thank you for that question. All right, very good. So we've got 4 questions here on the table, and I'm going to turn to the 3 of you. to a little bit cherry pick. I will not let anyone off the hook. So all of these questions will get answered. So we've got one with respect to what economists and frankly other government agencies can do in collaboration. Trevor, I think you could probably speak to that pretty well. One on disinformation, role of Facebook specifically. One on the interaction of the global partnership with the wider non-proliferation regime. That certainly is up your alley, Kathleen. Hope you'll take a stab at that. And a great question from our Mexican colleague in terms of just the exhaustion that haven't we solved this problem and when will it go away? And frankly, the prioritization of this. I mean, I spent a lot of my career working on these issues, traveling in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Caribbean, in other countries of the the quote-unquote global South. And they say to me, why should I prioritize this versus, I got a lot of problems here that I'm trying to figure out. So what is the answer to that question? So, Trevor, let's start with you.
Ali, thank you for the question about money, because it's a critically important one. Money talks. And when we're looking at talking to those who will appropriate our funds, whether it is Congress or in our case, Treasury Board, they want to know, why should we spend this money? And in our case, the answer is already, this isn't an expense, it's an investment. And it may sound like a nuance, but it's a very important one. We go armed with numbers. What would X cost? And in some cases, we extrapolate, where we'll say, and we have good numbers that we can use. If there were a large-scale attack with a nuclear, biological, or chemical agent, our estimation is it would cost the following. And we base it in real-life examples. SARS, the original SARS that came to Canada, 2004. Terrible tragedy for 40 families. There were 40 fatalities. It cost the Canadian economy 1.6 GDP for 2 years. Those numbers impressed Treasury Board. And they realized that if we can get ahead and if we can stop it, then indeed, it's like an insurance policy. No one likes to pay your insurance premium, but it's a hell of a lot better paying $60 or $70 a month than having your house burned down. And disinformation is very near and dear to my heart and Canada's priorities. I mentioned earlier that our program was targeted in 2011 in the Kyrgyz Republic. Canada was accused of building a lab of death. I was personally labeled an enemy of the people in the Kyrgyz Republic, as were many of my very devoted Kyrgyz colleagues. What is fascinating about that case? It didn't start in the Kyrgyz Republic. I won't tell you exactly where, but I think you can figure out. Someone didn't like us operating in their neighborhood. And the pathogens that we were accused of turning into biological weapons in this new facility we were building in Bishkek are the exact same pathogens, coincidentally, that Russia accused the United States and Ukraine of developing as bioweapons in February of last year. Coincidence? I think not. Facebook and some of these other tools are a huge problem. And we saw it during, we always see it, especially on the public health side. Anti-vaxxers and others who grab onto these platforms. What I will say about the global partnership, those aren't our targets. Quite frankly, we're not trying to change the opinion of Joe Q public as much as we would like to. Our target are governments. Governments who can be persuaded in places like the OPCW or the IAEA or the WHO that there's sufficient reason to believe that, well, you know what, you say this isn't true, but they've given us all of this evidence that it is. So we are actively targeting that group. We are working on a new effort between the G7, both the Global Partnership and something called the Rapid Response Mechanism, which has a target on disinformation. And we are looking at creating a non-responsive approach to counter WMD disinformation. And what I mean by that is right now we wait for somebody to say something bad about it, and then we try to deconstruct their narrative. It's a fool's game. We'll lose every time. So what we need to do is get ahead of the next WMD lie that's going to come, and that's what we're working on now.
Sabine.
Mm-hmm. Right. Other departments, Global Partnership, at least our program here in Ottawa, works very closely with quite a few of the other government departments. D&D, for example, National Defense, is an absolutely essential implementing partner for a lot of our programs. They used to run our chemical weapons preparedness / spillover or whatever program in Jordan, for example, when the chemical weapons come pouring out of Syria were becoming a concern. RCMP, ditto. I mean, we have some very active anti-proliferation task forces within the government, so they all know what they're doing. So that is interdepartmental process is not an issue. Well, what is an issue is the political knowledge and support, and that is something we clearly need to work on, and we need to be given the space to do. On the disinformation side, Trevor's absolutely right. It's key. I watched it firsthand when I was in The Hague and the Russians smeared Novichok agents on doorknobs in Salisbury. It was absolutely fascinating to trace the stories coming out of accounts on Twitter, not Facebook, but Twitter, associated with Russia. Within 24 hours, there were 23 different narratives out there as to what really happened, quote unquote. The idea, of course, not being to try to create a particular narrative, but to cast doubt. Like the idea of disinformation generally is to get the public to say, well, there's so much stuff out there, I don't know what to believe. And then not listening to the one narrative that is actually the truth, the objective truth, the facts, the evidence, and all the rest of it. So that is something absolutely we need to get ahead of, and it needs to be proactive. It cannot be reactive for that very reason. On the, you asked a question, somebody asked a question about the INF Treaty and open skies. I mean, those are Cold War mechanisms created under the auspices of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. To which I also was posted once upon a time, so I'm somewhat familiar with them, when they were still working. There isn't really, I mean, those are political creations, and without the political will underlying them, there isn't very much the global partnership can do, I think, to sustain the work. I mean, we can't, global partnership can't man some aircrafts and send them into some other state's airspace to investigate. That just cannot happen. I mean, that requires the political underlying structures and architecture to work. But what we can do, of course, is do our nuclear security work and do our non-proliferation work. How do we keep the stuff on the agenda? Well, I think that's the underlying question of this whole conference, isn't it? How do we get the work to be better known and better understood, especially in light of narratives like, oh yeah, the West is building biolabs in Kiev. It is something that we need to do. Unfortunately, and this goes back to something I said at the beginning, I said there isn't any political money or political value in prevention. There is also not a lot of political value in proactive engagement. Politics is reactive by its very nature. Something happens, oh my God, somebody better do something. Being proactive is much more difficult. So what we can do as, I say we as diplomats, used to be one, but is just to keep talking, literally. Use fora like this to spread the knowledge. And I'm looking to the NIPSIA students. You will come from this day, you will come away from this day armed with knowledge you didn't have coming into here. And hopefully that work that we did here today and the information you're getting today will inform your work going forward. And sometime, 10 years from now, when you're sitting behind a desk in some unnamed government, you'll recall, wait a minute, I knew there was an issue. Let's work on that. Creating ideas, building. So it's information sharing and dissemination that is going to be absolute key. And but there's also money that needs to be behind that. And I'm really happy to hear that our program is getting into disinformation, but that also includes pushing out information. And if we're doing that proactively as a business line, I think we'll be better off than we were before.
So Kathleen, you get the last word. I do not want to rush you by any stretch of the imagination. However, Professor Manulik has warned me that if I do not land this on time, he is unafraid to fail me. So I'm going to turn to you.
Yeah, no worries. I'll be very brief because my thoughts are swimming with how to answer these 4 questions, many of which I would have said the same thing. So I'll just go in rapid fire really quickly so I can interpret the questions. So the first one is, I think of as I understood it, what's the value of adding a variety of departments and agencies to help that thought process within the global partnership? And I would just offer up, certainly that's what we're doing in the United States, not just in terms of capacity building departments and agencies, but policy departments as well on how we form and identify what the threat is. So a firm yes to that. On disinformation, you said something, Trevor, that actually really resonates with me. But I think what's really important to understand is one of the reasons that we are countering disinformation is because it can get in the way of capacity building, get in the way of WMD threat reduction. If it can stop Canada in its tracks from assisting country X, Y, or Z from mitigating a threat, then that's reason enough to counter disinformation. And that's why we do. That's why we want to counter disinformation. As it relates to kind of the non-proliferation regimes and as I'm looking at my notes here, kind of the GP playing a role in that, I think as Sabine had mentioned, we're not a political entity. This is a group of like-minded members. We don't do anything in terms of that. It's all about capacity members, capacity assistance from each individual members, and sometimes they do it together and sometimes they do it bilaterally. But one of the things that GP members can do is assist a country in fulfilling some of those norms, and I think of assistance in fulfilling, say, 1540 obligations and things like that. So I'm almost done. With regard to the very last question, which is such a great question on how can we add it to the agenda, I actually am not going to be hubris enough to say I have an answer for you, but I will say that you've inspired me to reframe the question that we ask global partnership members all the time, which is, why are you a member of the GP, and why, how can we get you to be more active? Those are questions we should be asking of our GP members that maybe aren't as active as Canada and the United States and others, is how do we keep it on the agenda? How do we tie the global partnership to the priorities of your country, right? Whatever those priorities might be. So I will leave it with that, but thank you so much.
Well done. 30 seconds.
Alfonso, thank you for that great point. I would say to our politicians, they're often presented with problems for which there are no solutions. In this case, we are presenting them with what amounts to an existential threat for which we have a solution. So it is a matter of looking at our political leaders and reminding them of the old phrase, if it isn't broken, don't try to fix it. The global partnership is far from broken. It's an extremely effective machine. What it's missing is more countries that are actively contributing. So if we can raise the profile and say, here's something that we can do, something very concrete about to prevent future problems, that message hopefully will sell.
All right, so none of these three is leaving, or immediately after, at least not really. Well, even if they were planning on leaving, now that I say that, they looked like jerks if they ran us. So we're going to have a chance to corner them. And I hope you really do take advantage of it. As you can see, they have just such great expertise. We're going to get some direction as to what's going to happen from Professor Manuel. But maybe before we hear from him, if you would join me in thanking Kathleen, Sabine, and Trevor for their presentations this morning.